The cherry blossoms had long since fallen when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, watching the Pacific horizon blur into infinity. It was early May 1942, and the architect of Pearl Harbor was about to stake everything on one desperate gamble that would either crush American naval power forever or doom the Imperial Japanese Navy to catastrophic defeat. 6 months had passed since the surprise attack that had brought America into the war, and Yamamoto knew better than anyone that Japan's window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The industrial might of the United States was awakening like a sleeping giant, and every day that passed saw more American ships, planes, and trained personnel entering the Pacific theater. The Admiral's brilliant tactical mind had calculated that Japan possessed perhaps 18 months to achieve total victory before America's overwhelming production capacity would tip the scales irreversibly. The Americans must be drawn into decisive battle, Yamamoto had argued before the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. We cannot allow them to recover from Pearl Harbor and build their strength. Midway Island represents the perfect trap, close enough to Hawaii that they must defend it, yet far enough from their bases that we can destroy their fleet with overwhelming force. The plan that emerged from those heated discussions was breathtakingly ambitious in its scope and complexity. Operation MI, as it was designated, would involve virtually every major unit of the combined fleet: 6 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers, supported by dozens of submarines and auxiliary vessels. This massive armada would approach Midway from multiple directions, creating a web of steel and fire that no enemy force could possibly escape. Yamamoto's strategy relied on several key assumptions that seemed reasonable, given Japan's string of victories across the Pacific. First, that American codebreakers had not penetrated Japanese naval communications, a fatal miscalculation that would prove decisive. Second, that the U.S. Pacific Fleet still possessed only 2 operational aircraft carriers after the Coral Sea engagement, when in fact, the hastily repaired Yorktown would add crucial strength to Admiral Chester Nimitz's forces. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the Japanese plan called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention northward, followed by the main assault on Midway, that would supposedly catch the remaining Pacific Fleet by surprise. But aboard the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veteran pilots who had spearheaded Japan's expansion across the Pacific harbored quiet doubts about this latest operation. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, found himself troubled by intelligence reports suggesting increased American activity around Hawaii. The pilots had grown accustomed to facing obsolete aircraft flown by inexperienced enemies, but recent encounters suggested that American training and equipment were rapidly improving. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, shared these concerns, but kept them to himself as his fleet steamed eastward through gray Pacific swells. The burden of command weighed heavily on his shoulders. Success at Midway would likely end the war in Japan's favor, while failure could spell disaster for the empire. As May gave way to June, the die was cast, and 400 Japanese aircraft prepared to face whatever awaited them at the tiny coral atoll that would determine the fate of nations. In a basement bunker beneath Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over intercepted radio transmissions that would change the course of history. The thin, intense naval officer had spent months painstakingly reconstructing Japanese naval codes, and by late May 1942, his team at Station Hypo had achieved what many thought impossible. They were reading Admiral Yamamoto's most secret communications almost as quickly as his own staff. "AF is the target," Rochefort announced to his exhausted team of cryptographers and linguists. The Americans had suspected that AF referred to Midway Island, but confirmation required a clever deception that demonstrated the ingenuity of naval intelligence operations. Rochefort arranged for Midway's garrison to transmit a false message about water shortage problems, using a code he knew the Japanese could intercept. Within days, Japanese communications referenced AF's water problems, confirming beyond doubt that Midway was Yamamoto's objective. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the calm and methodical commander of the Pacific Fleet, studied the intelligence reports with growing excitement and trepidation. The intercepts revealed not just the target, but the timing, composition, and approach routes of the Japanese fleet. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans would have the advantage of knowing exactly when and where the enemy would strike. "Gentlemen," Nimitz addressed his staff in the humid confines of his headquarters, "we have been handed an extraordinary opportunity. The Japanese are committing virtually their entire fleet to this operation, confident that they can achieve surprise. Instead, we will be waiting for them." The American response would require every available ship and plane, stretched to the absolute limits of their capabilities. Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, would take position northeast of Midway. Task Force 17, centered on the hastily repaired Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, would provide additional striking power despite damage from the recent Coral Sea battle. The Yorktown's presence represented a miracle of American industrial capability and determination. Severely damaged by Japanese bombs just weeks earlier, the carrier had limped back to Pearl Harbor, where repair crews worked around the clock to restore her to fighting condition. Naval architects estimated that proper repairs would require 90 days in dry dock, but Nimitz could spare only 72 hours. Welders and technicians swarmed over the ship, patching hull plates and replacing damaged systems in a frenzy of activity that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. Meanwhile, Midway Island itself was transformed into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Every available fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance aircraft was flown to the tiny atoll, creating a concentration of air power that would complement the carrier forces. Marine defenders reinforced gun positions and prepared for what many expected would be the final battle of their lives. The contrast between American preparations and Japanese assumptions could not have been more stark. While Yamamoto's forces approached in confident expectation of surprising a weak and demoralized enemy, Nimitz's commanders studied detailed intelligence reports that revealed Japanese intentions with startling clarity. The hunters had become the hunted, though the Japanese remained blissfully unaware of their reversed fortunes. As June 3rd dawned clear and bright across the Pacific, both fleets moved toward their fateful rendezvous. The stage was set for a battle that would demonstrate the decisive importance of intelligence, industrial capacity, and tactical flexibility in modern naval warfare. Lieutenant Howard Ady squinted through the plexiglass canopy of his PBY Catalina flying boat as he swept across the empty Pacific at dawn on June 3, 1942. 900 miles west of Midway, his practiced eyes caught something that made his heart race. Dark shapes on the horizon that could only mean one thing. The Japanese fleet had been spotted. Main body bearing 260, distance 700 miles from Midway. Adi radioed back to base, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his discovery. Below him, 11 Japanese ships steamed steadily eastward, the Midway occupation force under Admiral Nobutake Kondo, advancing exactly as American intelligence had predicted. The radio crackled with acknowledgement from Midway, and within minutes, every American installation across the Pacific buzzed with activity. Admiral Nimitz's gamble was paying off. The Japanese were precisely where they were supposed to be, moving according to schedule toward what they believed would be their greatest victory. But this initial sighting represented only a fraction of Yamamoto's massive fleet. The main carrier striking force under Vice Admiral Nagumo remained hidden somewhere to the northwest, approaching under cover of a weather front that would shield them until they reached launching range. For the Japanese plan to succeed, these 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, needed to achieve complete surprise and destroy Midway's defenses before American reinforcements could arrive. On Midway itself, the first air raid alert sounded at 0300 hours as radar operators detected incoming aircraft. Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the 6th Marine Defense Battalion, had spent weeks preparing his men for this moment. Every gun emplacement, every foxhole, every ammunition dump had been positioned and camouflaged with meticulous care. The tiny island would sell itself dearly. 9 B-26 Marauders took off from Midway's single runway in the pre-dawn darkness. their crews knowing they faced overwhelming odds. These medium bombers had never been designed for maritime strike operations, but desperate circumstances called for desperate measures. As they disappeared into the gray Pacific dawn, their pilots carried with them the hopes of every American sailor and Marine in the Central Pacific. As referenced in Gordon Prange's definitive work, Miracle at Midway, the initial American attacks against the Japanese fleet proved largely ineffective, but served a crucial purpose in revealing enemy positions and forcing Japanese commanders to react to threats they had not anticipated. The element of surprise that Yamamoto had counted on was rapidly slipping away. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carriers, flight crews prepared for what they expected would be a routine strike against lightly defended American installations. Veteran pilots who had devastated Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies saw little reason to expect serious opposition from the small garrison they believed awaited them at Midway. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, still recovering from appendicitis that would keep him from flying, watched with growing unease as reconnaissance reports failed to locate the American carriers that intelligence suggested might be in the area. The absence of solid information about enemy fleet units troubled experienced officers who understood that modern naval warfare depended on accurate intelligence and careful coordination. At 0430 hours, the first wave of Japanese attack aircraft launched from their carriers, 108 planes strong and loaded with bombs, intended to neutralize Midway's defensive installations. As they winged toward their target through the brightening Pacific sky, neither side fully understood that they were about to participate in the most decisive naval battle in American history. The opening moves had been made, but the real test lay ahead, when carrier would face carrier in a battle that would demonstrate the revolution in naval warfare brought about by aviation technology. At 0615 on June 4, 1942, the peaceful morning calm over Midway Atoll was shattered by the thunder of approaching aircraft engines. 108 Japanese planes, dive bombers, level bombers, and fighters swept in from the northwest like a plague of mechanical locusts, their rising sun markings glinting in the early sunlight. Major Floyd Parks, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 221, led 26 obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters into what he knew would be a hopeless battle. These aging aircraft, nicknamed flying coffins by their pilots, were no match for the superbly trained Japanese aviators flying Superior Zero fighters. But Parks and his men climbed toward the enemy formation with the grim determination of Marines who understood that their sacrifice might buy precious time for the larger battle to come. "Tally-ho! Enemy fighters, 11 o'clock high!" Parks called over the radio as Zero fighters dove on his formation like hawks attacking sparrows. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 Marine fighters had been shot down, their pilots dead or struggling in the Pacific waters far below. Parks himself fell with his burning Buffalo, another casualty in Japan's seemingly unstoppable advance across the Pacific. But the Marine sacrifice was not in vain. While the fighters engaged the Japanese escort, anti-aircraft batteries across Midway opened fire with devastating effect. Every weapon on the island, from massive coast defense guns to individual Marines with rifle grenades, poured fire into the Japanese formation as it swept overhead. The attack that followed was both spectacular and limited in its effects. Japanese bombs cratered the runways, destroyed fuel storage tanks, and set numerous buildings ablaze, but the critical installations remained largely intact. The power plant continued operating, the command bunkers remained functional, and most importantly, the island's ability to launch aircraft was only temporarily impaired. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney watched the attack from his command bunker and immediately grasped both the opportunity and the danger of the situation. The Japanese had committed themselves to attacking Midway, but their first strike had been insufficient to neutralize the island's defenses. If American forces could locate and attack the Japanese carriers while their aircraft were returning from the strike, the enemy fleet would be caught at its most vulnerable moment. Every available American aircraft on Midway launched into the attack as soon as the Japanese bombers departed. 4 B-26 Marauders, 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, 16 Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and 11 Army B-17 flying fortresses took off from the battered but still functional airfield, their crews knowing they faced a Japanese fleet protected by hundreds of fighters. As these heroic attacks developed, Vice Admiral Nagumo faced a crucial decision aboard his flagship Akagi. His strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed that a second attack on Midway would be necessary to neutralize the island's defenses completely. But Nagumo had held back 93 aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, specifically to attack any American naval forces that might appear. The decision that followed would haunt Japanese naval officers for the rest of their lives. At 07:15, Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with land bombs for a second strike against Midway. This process would take over an hour to complete, during which time the Japanese carriers would be extraordinarily vulnerable to attack. Unknown to Nagumo, American search planes had already spotted his fleet. At 05:20, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, flying from the carrier Yorktown, had radioed the message that would change history. "Scratch 1 flat top. Dixon to carrier. Scratch 1 flat top." But this was premature. Dixon had spotted Japanese cruisers, not the precious carriers that represented Japan's primary striking power. The real prize remained hidden beneath a layer of clouds and morning haze, protected by a screen of destroyers and cruisers that bristled with anti-aircraft guns. But time was running out for both sides as the greatest carrier battle in naval history approached its climactic phase. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Commander Minoru Genda watched with growing anxiety as armorers struggled to rearm the strike aircraft crowded on the flight deck. It was 08:30 on June 4, 1942, and what should have been a routine operation had become a nightmare of conflicting orders and mounting confusion. Vice Admiral Nagumo had just received the most unwelcome message possible from his reconnaissance aircraft. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The presence of American naval forces fundamentally changed the tactical situation and demanded an immediate response, but Nagumo's aircraft were in the worst possible configuration for such an emergency. The Japanese admiral faced a devil's bargain that would have challenged the most experienced naval commander. His first wave of aircraft was returning from Midway, low on fuel and requiring immediate recovery. His second wave was half-armed with land bombs instead of the armor-piercing weapons needed for naval targets. Meanwhile, American aircraft from Midway were already attacking his fleet, forcing defensive maneuvers that disrupted flight operations. "Change armament to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs," Nagumo ordered, countermanding his earlier instructions. "Prepare for immediate launch against enemy fleet units." But the damage was already done. Precious time had been lost, and the flight decks were now cluttered with ordnance handlers frantically switching weapons, while fuel lines snaked across the decks to service returning aircraft. As referenced in Mitsuo Fuchida's first-hand account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the Japanese carriers had become floating powder kegs, their decks stacked with armed aircraft, fuel hoses, and loose ordnance that would prove catastrophically vulnerable to enemy attack. At 09:20, the first wave of American torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon. 15 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 launched from the carrier Hornet under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. These obsolete aircraft, flying without fighter escort, approached the Japanese fleet in a hopeless attack that would cost them everything but buy crucial time for the main American strike. "My God, they're sitting ducks," observed Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey from his SBD Dauntless dive bomber high above the battle. McCluskey commanded 37 dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise, and he had been circling for nearly an hour searching for the Japanese fleet. Below him, Waldron's torpedo bombers pressed their attack with suicidal courage, drawing every Japanese fighter down to sea level in a desperate defensive action. The slaughter was complete and terrible. Within minutes, all 15 Devastators had been shot down, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the battle from his life raft. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The Japanese fighters were now out of position and low on fuel, unable to defend against the high-altitude attack that was about to descend upon them. At 0:10:24, McCluskey spotted the Japanese carriers through a break in the clouds and immediately pushed over into his attack dive. 37 American dive bombers screamed down through the clear Pacific sky toward targets that could not have been more perfectly prepared for destruction. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were caught with their flight decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, their crews desperately trying to launch a strike force that would never get airborne. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the first section of dive bombers, selected the Akagi as his target and released his 1,000-pound bomb at 1,500 feet altitude. The weapon struck just behind the carrier's midships elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck before exploding among the armed and fueled aircraft waiting to launch. Secondary explosions followed immediately as aviation gasoline ignited and torpedo warheads detonated in a chain reaction that doomed Japan's most prestigious aircraft carrier. Similar scenes of destruction played out aboard the Kaga and Soryu as American bombs found their marks with devastating precision. Within the space of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from mighty warships into blazing funeral pyres that would carry the dreams of Japanese empire to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The tide of war had turned in those brief, terrible minutes above the blue waters of Midway. The acrid smoke from 3 burning aircraft carriers stung Vice Admiral Nagumo's eyes as he stood on the bridge of the Akagi at 10:46 on June 4, 1942. Around him, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy fought desperately to save their flagship, but the carrier was doomed. Fuel fires raged out of control in the hangar spaces. Ammunition exploded in devastating secondary blasts, and the flight deck buckled under the intense heat of burning aviation gasoline. "Sir, we must transfer your flag," urged Captain Taijiro Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer. "The ship cannot be saved." The words hung in the smoky air like a death sentence for Japanese hopes in the Pacific. This was the same carrier from which the Pearl Harbor attack had been launched just 6 months earlier, and now she was dying beneath the bombs of the very enemy she had sought to destroy. But Japan's agony was not yet complete. The carrier Hiryu, slightly separated from her sister ships, had escaped the devastating American attack and was preparing her own counterstrike. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2, was determined to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the mobile force. "Launch immediately," Yamaguchi ordered his strike commander. "Target the American carriers before they can attack us again." 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters lifted off from the Hiryu's deck, carrying Japan's hopes for revenge against the force that had just delivered such a crushing blow to their fleet. The Japanese strike, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, found the American task force 2 hours later. Their target was the carrier Yorktown, still bearing scars from the Battle of the Coral Sea, but fighting with desperate efficiency under Captain Elliot Buckmaster. The Japanese attacked with the skill and courage that had made them masters of the Pacific, but they faced anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented intensity from American ships that had learned hard lessons about defending against air attack. 3 Japanese bombs struck the Yorktown in quick succession, penetrating her flight deck and starting fires in the interior of the ship. But American damage control techniques, refined through months of hard experience, proved superior to anything the Japanese had developed. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was back in action, her flight deck operational and her aircraft launching for another strike against the remaining Japanese carrier. As referenced in Walter Lord's masterful Incredible Victory, the resilience demonstrated by American ships and crews during the Battle of Midway reflected both superior damage control training and the industrial capacity that allowed rapid repair of battle damage using standardized parts and equipment. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway Island. These aircraft found the Yorktown again, and this time their torpedoes struck home with devastating effect. The carrier took on a severe list and lost power, forcing Captain Buckmaster to order abandon ship. But American vengeance was already in the air. 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, had located the Hiryu and were beginning their attack run, just as Tomonaga's aircraft were landing back aboard their ship. The Japanese carrier, caught in the same vulnerable condition that had doomed her sisters, could not avoid the fate that awaited her. 4 direct hits from American dive bombers transformed the Hiryu into another blazing wreck within minutes. Admiral Yamaguchi, choosing death over the dishonor of defeat, remained aboard his flagship as she settled slowly toward the bottom of the Pacific. By nightfall on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers lay destroyed or sinking, their aircraft and crews scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The once mighty mobile force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had been utterly destroyed in a single day. Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific was broken, and the initiative in the war had passed permanently to the United States. The setting sun that evening illuminated the funeral pyres of Japanese naval aviation, marking the beginning of the end for the empire that had dreamed of dominating the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the communications center of the battleship Yamato, as devastating reports flooded in from the disaster unfolding 300 miles to the east. It was evening on June 4th, 1942, and the architect of Pearl Harbor was witnessing the destruction of everything he had worked to build. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew dead, and Japan's offensive momentum in the Pacific shattered beyond repair. "All carriers lost, sir," reported his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, his voice barely above a whisper. "Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu are either sunk or sinking. The mobile force has ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit." The magnitude of the disaster defied comprehension. In a single day, Japan had lost more naval aviation capacity than could be replaced in years of intensive production. Worse still, the veteran pilots and aircrew who had spearheaded Japan's expansion across the Pacific were gone forever. Men whose experience and skill represented decades of training and combat knowledge that no amount of industrial effort could quickly restore. Yamamoto's mind raced through the strategic implications of what had occurred. The carefully planned timetable for Japanese expansion had assumed the destruction of American naval aviation at Midway, clearing the way for operations against Fiji, Samoa, and eventually the Hawaiian Islands themselves. Instead, the American Pacific Fleet remained intact and had demonstrated a level of tactical skill and fighting efficiency that boded ill for future Japanese operations. Captain Kuroshima, the fleet operations officer, proposed continuing the battle with the massive surface fleet still available. "Sir, we retain overwhelming superiority in battleships and cruisers. If we can bring the Americans to surface action, we can still achieve victory." But Yamamoto understood better than his subordinates that the age of the battleship had ended over the smoking wrecks of his aircraft carriers. Surface ships, no matter how powerful, could not operate effectively without air cover against an enemy that retained strong carrier forces. The fundamental nature of naval warfare had been revolutionized, and Japan had just learned this lesson in the most costly way possible. "Signal all units," Yamamoto ordered with characteristic decisiveness. "Operation MI is cancelled. All forces will withdraw to the west immediately." The admission of defeat came hard to officers trained in the samurai tradition that preferred death to dishonor, but Yamamoto's strategic vision remained clear despite the emotional devastation of the moment. The withdrawal of the Japanese fleet marked more than just the end of a failed operation. It represented the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Never again would Japanese forces possess the strength and confidence to launch major offensive operations against heavily defended American positions. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the United States, and with it went Japan's last hope of achieving a negotiated peace from a position of strength. As referenced in John Keegan's comprehensive analysis, The Second World War, the Battle of Midway represented the decisive turning point in the Pacific theater, marking the moment when Japan's expansion reached its furthest extent and began the inexorable contraction that would end 3 years later with surrender in Tokyo Bay. The human cost of this strategic reversal was measured not just in ships and aircraft, but in the lives of Japan's finest naval aviators. Men like Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shirane, who had led attacks at Pearl Harbor and across the Dutch East Indies, perished in the waters around Midway along with hundreds of their comrades. These losses could not be replaced quickly, enough to maintain Japan's qualitative edge in naval aviation, particularly as American training programs began producing pilots in unprecedented numbers. As the Japanese fleet limped westward through the darkness, Yamamoto contemplated the broader implications of the defeat. Japan's fundamental strategic problem, the impossibility of matching American industrial production in a prolonged conflict, had been dramatically emphasized by the events at Midway. The window of opportunity that might have led to a negotiated settlement had closed forever in the span of a few terrible hours on June 4, 1942. The morning sun of June 5, 1942, rose over a Pacific Ocean transformed by 24 hours of the most decisive naval combat in history. Where the proud carriers of the Japanese mobile force had steamed confidently toward their rendezvous with destiny, only oil slicks and floating debris marked their passage into the depths. The Battle of Midway was over, and with it died Japan's dreams of Pacific domination. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying after-action reports that confirmed what intelligence intercepts had promised, but few had dared believe possible. The Japanese combined fleet, seemingly invincible after 6 months of unbroken victories, had been decisively defeated by forces less than half its size. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, over 300 aircraft lost, and most crucially, the irreplaceable cadre of veteran pilots that had formed the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, lay dead in the waters around Midway. "Sir," reported his intelligence officer, "preliminary estimates suggest the Japanese have lost over 250 experienced aircrew, including many squadron and flight commanders. These represent the most experienced naval aviators in their entire fleet." The strategic implications were staggering. Japan could build new aircraft carriers, though it would take years. But replacing the skilled pilots and aircrew required decades of training and combat experience that the empire could no longer afford. American pilot training programs, meanwhile, were expanding rapidly, producing thousands of new aviators who would soon fill the ranks of an ever-growing Pacific fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose dive bombers had delivered the fatal blows to the Japanese carriers, found himself promoted to commander and awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership during the battle. But like many veterans of Midway, McCluskey understood that their victory had been achieved through a combination of courage, skill, and extraordinary good fortune that might not be repeated. The human cost of victory weighed heavily on American commanders as well. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been virtually annihilated in its gallant but futile attack on the Japanese fleet. Of 42 aircrew who had launched from American carriers that morning, only 20 returned to their ships. The price of victory in modern naval warfare was measured in the lives of young men whose sacrifice had purchased time for the decisive strike that followed. As referenced in the official U.S. Navy history, The Battle of Midway by Office of Naval Intelligence, the tactical innovations developed during this engagement, particularly the coordination of dive bomber and torpedo attacks to overwhelm enemy defenses, would become standard doctrine for American naval aviation throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The psychological impact of the Midway defeat reverberated throughout Japanese society and military leadership. Emperor Hirohito, upon learning of the disaster, reportedly observed that Japan might need to consider ending the war before American industrial superiority became overwhelming. Though such thoughts remained private, they reflected a growing recognition among Japan's leaders that the conflict had entered a new and dangerous phase. For America, Midway represented vindication of the pre-war investment in naval aviation and intelligence capabilities that had seemed questionable to many observers. The code-breaking efforts that had provided crucial intelligence about Japanese intentions demonstrated the decisive importance of information warfare in modern conflict. Admiral Nimitz later observed that the battle was won in the basement cryptography centers of Pearl Harbor as much as in the skies over the Pacific. The final irony of the Battle of Midway lay in its demonstration of how completely naval warfare had been revolutionized by aviation technology. Admiral Yamamoto's massive battleships, the pride of the Japanese fleet, had been rendered irrelevant by the destruction of their air cover. Surface ships, no matter how powerful, could no longer operate effectively without control of the air, a lesson that would influence naval strategy for generations to come. As news of the victory spread across America, it provided the first clear evidence that Japan could be defeated and that the long road to victory in the Pacific had begun. The tide of war had turned forever in those crucial hours of June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers screamed down through the Pacific sky to write the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire.